encourage participation in shaping the kind of societies that we want and need. Communication, knowledge, striving for better, that's all part of societies everywhere. Journalists are the agents of a process important to all of us, that of gaining access to knowledge so that as many people as possible can make informed decisions. Now, journalists are symbols of the principles of freedom of speech that tie us all together. Now, we won't agree, but if public discourse has a plurality of positions being put across in the firm knowledge that we are all, as far as possible, dealing with realities, then dialogue is authentic and genuinely reflect the issues that affect us. But it's tough making these lofty, abstract ideas actually have the real world impact that we hope for. So sometimes it goes wrong or we get it wrong. It's been a difficult year for the reputation of journalism in several parts of the world, and today to discuss the importance of quality journalism and the role it plays in shaping peaceful, just and inclusive societies. I'm joined on the panel by, of course, His Excellency Mr. Jose Ramos Horta. Thank you very much again for giving us a little bit of extra time to discuss the question of the day. We've got Ms. Farhana Haq Rahman, Director General of Inter-Press Services, a news agency aiming to give prominence to the voices of marginalized and vulnerable people and groups, particularly those in the Southern Hemisphere. Thanks very much for coming, Farhana. We've got Mr. Peter Greste. He's an Australian-born freelance journalist. And you may remember, whilst working for Al Jazeera back in 2013, he and two other colleagues were arrested on pretty flimsy terrorism charges. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison, but after 400 days was released, as thankfully were his colleagues a little while afterwards. So thank you very much for coming. We've also got Miss Elif Akgul. She is the Freedom of Speech editor for Biyanet. Now that's a project in Turkey that's been promoting rights-based and peace journalism since 2000. And of course we've got Mr. Josep Adi Prasetyo, the chairman of the Indonesian Press Council, one of the founders of the Alliance of Independent Journalists, and the former vice chairman of the Indonesian National Commission on Human Rights. So first of all, I'm going to kick off by addressing this question of journalism being in crisis. Peter, do you think that is an accurate representation of where we are at the moment, or is it more of a flux?
No, I think it is a crisis. I mean, as we heard from Richard earlier, the digital revolution has changed the way that we all have to work. It's changed the business models, it's destroyed the business models, and everyone here knows that we're facing where we've got two things have happened. The first is that it's never been easier to be published, it's never been easier to get our stories out there, but it's never been harder to make a living. And at the same time, what we're seeing is an erosion of public trust. And for me, something that I take very personally is we're seeing governments increasingly use national security as a way of clamping down on press freedom. As a way of eroding the kind of space that journalists are able to operate in. And when you bring all of these things together, I think it really does amount to a crisis. That doesn't mean that we don't have opportunities at this point, but it does mean that we are facing a very, very difficult time. And unless we engage in these conversations, then we're going to find ourselves far worse off. And
you have seen, Your Excellency, you've seen a lot of what can be done with journalism in terms of changing the world for good. Do you also, over your career, think that where we are now is different to perhaps other turbulent times within the profession?
I would say that for the common citizen, anywhere in the world, the introduction of digital media, social media, this extraordinary development of the last 20 years can only be good. I personally prefer to have a irresponsible, loose cannon journalist than not having free media at all. In the past, recent past, someone like me or anyone in public life disagree with an article written by a journalist who dropped into my country, for 2-3 days, became an instant expert, published partial stories, unfounded allegations, and then we almost have to beg, right into the letters to the editor section. And they might publish, they might not. Well, today I don't bother writing to the editor section. I publish in my Facebook page that sometimes has more reach than the newspaper that published that story. So for me and for citizens around the world, the uncontrolled, maybe irresponsible, unmanaged social media is better than having only to rely on the establishment commercial media controlled by big economic interests.
But if you say it's better, is not the question of quality going straight to the heart of, you know, what individuals may decide to publish because of their particular individual perspective on something?
Before gutter journalism in modern social media, we had already gutter journalism in the mainstream media, in print media, going back 50 years. In UK, you have exceptional newspapers that I read every day, like The Guardian. But UK has a long list of gutter print media, been there for generations. In the US, it's the same. I read every day the New York Times, but throughout the US, you have also some absolutely bad newspapers. So for me, what is the difference between the very bad conservative print media in the US, all over Europe and other countries that I don't know, and the digital media where with instant journalists, instant commentators, so no difference at all. And again, some of the worst crimes happen in our modern times. In the Balkans, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, it happened partly because media, no free media, or media that willingly collaborated with Milosevic, disseminated anti-Muslim, anti-Bosnian, anti-Kosovars propaganda and led to. In Rwanda, it was through radio, owned by communities, by the church, that contributed to genocide in Rwanda. That was before social media. And the mainstream media, with exceptions, I have to say, initially I was a reluctant viewer of Al Jazeera. Friends of mine jumped from CNN to Al Jazeera. I would write to one or two of them and say, I'm not going to watch you again. And well, then one day I tune in to Al Jazeera. I like it. And now I watch it every day. It is one of the best, Al Jazeera English, one of the best alternatives to many other mainstream English and French and Spanish, Portuguese channels I've seen. So I pay tribute to that as well. And Al Jazeera does really in-depth news stories. They don't do 10-second stories. They do. Even the news coverage is in-depth. So this is exceptional, the quality of Al Jazeera. And France 24. She's with,
I was not angling for that. But I'm just going to interrupt there because I just want to jump on that point that you said about there not being a difference between potentially inaccurate perspectives being shared on social media and tabloid stories being shared in the traditional print media. You have grown up perhaps a little bit more than the rest of us with social media and getting your news through that. Do you also feel that stories that may be propagated through Facebook or Twitter or the like have the same potential to do damage as inaccurate stories that may be published in the traditional press?
Actually, it does in a lot of ways. I mean, with social media, Twitter and Facebook, it really creates its own writers, its own storytellers. So every person, every individual becomes a storyteller as well as like a journalist. And as well as it's democratizing the information itself, it also creates democratizing the fake news. So any high influenced tabloid or any traditional media has power to create or spread the fake news or the good news. It has the same power for social media as well, and sometimes even more, because if you want to access the information in a traditional way, in like a print media, you have to go outside, you have to go to the store, and you have to buy the media itself. You have to pay for that. But otherwise, on social media, we are actually talking to our own circles, and our own circles has the same impact for their own circles. So it's the term viral comes actually from that. I mean, it spreads even much more than the traditional media.
So perhaps bearing in mind just how much attention is being paid to this new form of spreading information and access to knowledge online, we should be focusing more on audiences, empowering audiences to understand and filter the information that they become exposed to through whichever medium. Stanley, I believe that you prefer being called. Is this something that within Indonesian media you're trying to incorporate in the way that you work?
Yeah, I think the notion of press freedom includes two things. The first, the structure, yeah, freedom from, and the second is freedom to. That the freedom of the press is also measured by how the press use the independence. I think we want our Indonesian journalists didn't use any information for social media. They must check and verification the information to use as news.
But how do they do that? How do they do that?
Yeah, they can get the information from the media social, but when they want to make a news, they must verification and check and recheck the information. Indonesian Press Council want to cut off between vicious cycle between hoax source, yeah, to use by media social, and to use the media online, to use the television, radio, and media mainstream.
Okay. Now, I feel that often we keep on saying the word journalism like it's one homogenous industry. And bearing in mind, you know, how many people here come from a vastly different background, a vastly different experience of the media, do you perhaps feel that we are inaccurately trying to address the problems of journalism by talking about it as if we're dealing with the same kinds of problems? You also, Farhana, have worked for an organization that really tries to give voice to perhaps more marginalized communities. When we talk about the journalism industry, do you genuinely feel that we are addressing the issues relevant to the communities that you specifically represent?
Yes and no. To a great extent, we feel that. In our type of business, the Interpress service, we report from the field as much as possible, as authentically as possible, and often we find that readership for the type of reports that we bring from the field is very different from what everybody sees every day, you know, great photography, great videos on mainstream media. So our job is extremely difficult, And I take cue also from what Mr. Horta just said, that it's easier to publish now, you know, on many, many various channels. But we don't find that so. We find it extremely difficult because of people's not only attention span, but interest more in what mainstream media is bringing for them. And as we were discussing yesterday evening, that media has taken the shape and form more of entertainment. And I'm not just talking about, you know, videos and films and all, but even reporting has become a form of entertainment. And to ride that, we really need a lot of finances, which many of the organizations that are closer to grassroots, that are reporting from the field and not bringing in and flying out journalists, you know, for 2 days and filing reports which may or may not be correct or right. It's extremely difficult for us to sell that information that we bring from journalists who are at the field level in the various countries.
When it comes to money as well, another interesting point that was raised last night when we were just having a bit of a pre-brief was perhaps the silencing of certain voices who potentially would become journalists or enter the journalism industry because of the fact it's pretty hard to make a living. Olivia, you brought that particular aspect up. Just tell us a little bit more about your concerns on that front.
Well, actually, I was just thinking about the same thing when it comes to the problem of the crisis of the journalism. The media ownership stays in something else because as journalists, okay, we are providing the information, we are getting the information, we try to serve in, we work in the public good, as it says, but we are also people, individuals who has to work, who has to, you know, earn life and pay rents and, you know, go to school, etc. So the media ownership becomes the critical, even in 2014 and 2015's Freedom House reports, media ownership itself and the monopolizing of the media is become one of the most critical problems in the journalism industry. And when it comes to the news making itself is a very expensive thing, expensive job. It's very expensive to gather the information, spread it, and also the whole process between it. So I can say, for example, I'm talking about the Turkish version of the journalism sector. Either you are pro-government or, you know, pro-authoritarian, which one, pro-authority, which one is that, it doesn't matter. You can have media owners as businessmen who has the ties and strong ties with the, you know, the authorities, and otherwise you can be opponents who are starved or maybe just voluntarily work or just, you know, working in daily jobs and doing others, doing journalism side event, I can say. So the media ownership, the being an expensive issue that providing information creates the monopolies that actually spreads the most mainstream information itself, and those informations sometimes become the fake news.
I think, just jumping in, I think one of the problems is that we're allowed, and this is interesting, it comes back also to what Richard was saying earlier in his keynote, that we seem to be allowing, what we seem to be doing as journalists is trying to struggle to figure out how to make money from the new digital environment. When in fact what we really need to be doing, because what we're doing is allowing the technology to drive the form of journalism. We're all trying to figure out how to get money, how to both pay for good quality journalism and stay alive. And we're all trying to figure out how to make the technology work. What we ought to be doing is perhaps inverting the question and saying, okay, what is it that we want from the media, and how do we then develop the technologies and the legal framework, because there's also a role for governments here, to provide us, to get to that point. If we don't, if we simply allow the technology to drive things as it is at the moment, we're going to end up, we might possibly maybe end up with something that works. But there's also a very good chance that we're going to end up with a mess. And at the moment, it looks as though from my eyes, from the conversation that we've been having here, that we're heading more towards a mess than we are towards something really positive and productive. And this is a very difficult, long conversation, but I think it's something that everybody in this room needs to start having. What is it that we want? What do we need the media to provide a healthy, functioning democracy? And then figure out how we create the environment, both technological and legal, to get us to that point. Then I think we're having the right conversations. At the moment, that's not happening.
And those standards that perhaps we should be chasing could be actually independent of those environments within which attention can be paid to chasing the technological options, because there are I mean, Mr. Ramaswamy, you were also raising concerns about the limitations of journalism in perhaps more deprived communities. Now, the professional ethics that we should be aiming towards would be as relevant to a more deprived community as it would be to New York. So how do we as an industry pull together to at least create that floor of operation and the way that we approach the kind of very fundamentals of what is journalism? Please, Peter.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't really have answers for this, and I don't think it's something that's up to journalists alone. We can't provide it ourselves. But particularly as the media, as an industry that has at least some control over public debate, what we ought to be doing is introducing this public debate. We need to be engaging with politicians, with our public leaders, to say, okay, you want credible news, you want news that challenges and holds the powerful to account, but also engages the public debate in a well-informed discussion that isn't sensationalist, that isn't driven by clickbait. If that's what politicians and governments want, it's also what I would like as a journalist. How do we create the media environment that pays for that in a way that's sustainable, that isolates the media from both commercial and political pressures, and that takes best advantage of the technology that's available to us? Those are conversations that involve the politicians, the media itself, and the technologists. And there are groups like Google who are at the center of that conversation, as well as governments. And I really think we need to start to have those conversations now. If we don't do it now, we're going to find ourselves in a mess.
Well, just picking up on the point that you made about... Oh, sorry, did you want to jump in? Please.
Maybe a bit different angle. Of course, the media bring us close to faraway realities, or even some realities that near us we don't know about. Tragedies in Syria, Yemen, South Sudan. We know about it, we feel about it, thanks to the courage of journalists. But I also would suggest, and these stories are extremely discouraging, heartbreaking, but in the midst of all of this, there are extraordinary peaceful communities around the world. There are extraordinary individuals doing great things around the world. They are not news. No war, no news, no earthquakes, no tsunami, no news. But the world is not only made up of the man-made and nature-made tragedies. So, what is said is some of the inspiring, beautiful stories occurring on a daily basis in Indonesia, anywhere in Asia, in my country, in the US, we don't hear about, because they are positive stories. But they should be told because they inspire, they give hope to people who lost hope. And because I have to tell you, I was the chairman of a UN panel called UN Independent Panel on Peace Operations. And it was a report to the Commission by Secretary General, report to Security Council, General Assembly. In the course of my work for a year, one story that really captured my attention, and I put on the first page of my report, is the story of a 3-year-old girl in South Sudan, and I found the story in Huffington Post. Huffington Post, which give us, me including, plenty of space to write. And that girl, 3 years old, South Sudan, she guided her blind father for 4 hours through the bush, through the fighting, into a United Nations UNICEF feeding center to look for food. She was the one guiding. It was a UNICEF gentleman there, young gentleman, spotted the girl in interview. It was the girl who explained the whole. She was a spokesperson for her father. And I dedicated my report. Usually these reports would be known like the Brahimi report, you know, in the past would be Brahimi report. My report would have been known as the Ramos Horta report. I told people in New York at the UN Security Council, please don't call it Ramos Horta report. Call it Nyakahat report, because that's the name of the girl. I dedicate to her. Nyakahat, her story tells 2 stories. The failure of the United Nations, the failure of the international community in preventing the war in South Sudan. But also it tells the story that in spite of the failings, weaknesses of the UN, it was the UN that saved her. If the UN had not been there, in spite of its weaknesses, many more people would have died. But that story, beautiful human story, by chance got into Huffington Post, and not even a major story in Huffington Post. Luckily, I saw it. I put in my UN report, everybody in the UN General Assembly read, saw about it. I put in my Facebook page. For many months, she was the cover of my Facebook page, which, by the way, has more readership than Donald Trump's following. I'm joking. But anyway. So I would say, please, journalists, look for beautiful, inspiring stories in Indonesia, in Timor, in Thailand, in Myanmar, or in Brazil, anywhere. Besides, of course, educating us, informing us about the tragedies that happen.
But if we're looking at in journalism as a whole throughout the entire world, from all the plethora of media organizations and options, particularly bearing in mind we're talking about how much news and how many stories are being shared online, is it really true, or is it really fair to say that a lot of the reporting that actually is available isn't covering positive stories? Jakob, I haven't heard from you for a while. Do you think that it is a true reflection of journalism to say that we do not cover positive stories enough? Or is it perhaps just that the public recollection of the stories that we cover focuses more on the negative?
Yeah, I think now public and participation, active participation in the making the news. Yeah, but I think the main task of journalism is to tell the truth. Truth in journalism is not an absolute truth, but is a functional truth. Yeah, a truth that is believed to be at the moment and open to correction. And I think the main commitment of journalism is the public interest. Personal interest, groups or interest of media owner should always be placed under the public interest. Now, I think it's important to back and to recommitment with the code of ethics, journalism code of ethics.
May I add something here? Like, when it's coming to the meeting
Mike.
the floor, meeting at the floor of the quality journalism, I mean, we have to meet with the audience, our readers as well, readers or the watchers. I mean, if, as you said, the public also participates the whole gathering the information, spreading the information, and even shaping the information itself. But as we know, as a journalist, we only tell the truth. Yeah, we claim that we only tell the truth, but in this reality, we are living in a world that actually, in an era that authoritarians calling journalists as liars on air, and 50 million people are voted for them. So maybe we have to have an understanding with our audiences that actually we need a quality of journalism, and it's not just up to us in that part. Because again, I'm coming to the post-truth issue, that post-truth is not just fake news that's spreading. I have actually just checked on the Oxford Dictionary the term of the, and it means that it's the personal beliefs and senses has more influence than the truth itself. Actually, it says something. It creates alternative realities that we don't live in it. And we have to look at if the audience itself also has to look at if they want to have the information and they really want to learn the truth, and they need to learn how to confirm it. As a journalist, I have to confirm it. It's my job. But also I have, as a crisis of my profession right now, I have the credential issues, like, you know, the authorities, the presidents, the vice presidents are addressing to my profession as liars, and they said that don't believe the media, and they do it on air, on media, ironically. And so the confirmation process also, I think, ties the audience and the people who wants to have the information, who wants to learn what's going on in the world, who wants to hear the other stories, has to also participate in confirmation itself. And the post-truth is actually lies on the, you know, that awkward moment when you share something on Facebook that you saw, and it spreads the hate speech, it spreads the fake news, it spreads the alternative realities and influence as well as going on. But as journalists on meeting on that floor, also we have to make an agreement between ourselves too. We have to make, agree that we need our quality, we need our ethics, we need to agree on that. We have universal ethics as journalists, that we don't exaggerate, that we don't lie, that we have to confirm, that we don't harm. So we have to meet on that point. And when you said that it's the positive news, actually I truly agree with that. I mean, it's not just the bad news are the news. The positive news are the news, but which one is the most clickable? Which one takes, I mean, we heard about the Syrian refugees when in the Olympics, as you know, Olympic team, and it was fabulous. But just that time, as we heard Syrian refugees in a positive way. Otherwise, we have heard the awful stories, dreadful stories, or, you know, the Aylan Kurdi baby that has drowned in the agency, and it creates a vibe in the media. But it's also a part of, as you said, an entertainment, because it actually provokes our senses and it provokes our emotions. So we are, as audiences, are clicking that news.
So from what I understand, we should, on one hand, be, rather than just drawing a line between ourselves as journalists and the audience, perhaps invite the audience a little bit closer into our processes so they are better equipped to be able to digest and check and understand the quality of stories they may be exposed to. But also, you said that we should have a stronger code of ethics. But how do we do that? We should. We talk about, every year we get together, we have World Press Freedom Day, we talk about the things that we should do, but how do we get closer to actually coordinating any kind of concrete idea of the floor of the way that we operate as journalists? Farhana?
One of the things that we find we face almost every day is what happens in the southern countries, in developing countries, and journalists reporting from developing countries not necessarily are reporting along the same lines with the same values or non-values of the northern journalists. There's a huge gap there, the expectation. And we have a Nobel laureate here. I'll give you the example of another Nobel laureate, Professor Muhammad Yunus. the microcredit movement, it came under a lot of attack from the journalists, not because they understood that there was something fundamentally wrong, but because many of them were making a name locally by being controversial. And in being controversial, there was also civil society involved, etc. And you know, there are vested interest, quarters. It became a huge issue. So what was important at that point, and this was in my previous capacity when I worked in the United Nations, is to train journalists to understand that microcredit is not just about borrowing money. There is more to it. Microfinance, you know, there's insurance, there is savings, so on and so forth. And I remember that once we did that, reporting changed quite a bit. People were taking more care to represent the facts and the benefits to that society. As I said, there are vested interest, quarters, and you know, there is still controversy around it. It's been tried, you know, in various forms elsewhere. But the first thing we had to do was to empower the journalists to understand. So sometimes we find that when we ask a journalist to report from Indonesia or from East Timor, they have a tendency, more often than not, because of lack of resources, to report in a superficial manner. But we insist that we value those reports that will have people quoted in those reports, you know, from the field. So they are obliged to go out and look into the possibility of getting real life stories from the field, and that adds value. Now, we all know, you know, what happens in the north today has a huge impact on the south and vice versa. But it's totally two different kind of forms or mechanism running parallel. And quite often I find people talking about technology, etc. Let's not forget, in many of the developing countries, and I can tell you about South Asia, you know, the load shedding that happens. I know of friends in New Delhi, professors, who go to a certain point so that they're able to prepare their reports for their students that day, or prepare, you know, the lessons for the students, because it's, lots of things are not taken for granted. It's not so easy, you know. So social media and all of that are very powerful, I agree. Technology has advanced, I agree. But I think we need to be very aware what percentage of population is benefiting from that, and what percentage of the media worldwide is taking advantage of that fully.
So you're talking about inequality. And on one hand, we've seen a lot of polarization politically around the world, because rooted in people's frustrations over equality. Journalism, as you've just pointed out, is not immune to the negative effects of inequality. So what do you think that we as an industry can do to try and absorb the inequalities that may be seen between geographically, colleagues who may be placed geographically differently and facing different pressures? Peter.
Gosh, good question.
Well, in the past, you particularly have said that, you know, we should be pulling together.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is slightly off message when it comes to sort of equality, but one of the things, look, one of the great lessons from our experience in Egypt, well, there are two things. The first is just how much we can achieve when journalists pull together as one. I don't think we've ever seen in the history of the media journalists unite together around a single common cause in the way that they did ours. I still don't understand why it happened, but I'm very grateful for that, and I honestly think we would still be in prison if it weren't for that unity of purpose. That's the good news, that we are actually able to achieve these kinds of things. But the bad news is that it took such massive effort, and took such the kind of effort that we've really only seen in very, very rare occasions. We're starting to see it develop now around journalists in Turkey who are imprisoned in Turkey, and in fact today we've published, me and Mohammed Fahmy, one of my colleagues, has published a jointly authored op-ed that's been published around the world calling for that same kind of unity of purpose. If we can work together, if we can find a common voice somehow, then I think we can deal with a lot of these problems and perhaps bridge some of that gap. Alone it's not going to work, it's not a solution on its own, but it is something that we need to bear in mind, and I think we need to think a lot more about uniting, about trying to coordinate our messages and our thinking and our appeals, because it does actually make a tremendous difference.
So there you're not talking, we're talking about the addressing perhaps some of the kind of inequality between various groups of journalists in terms of the support system that they have
we were lucky, and again this is slightly off message from what where the direction the conversation was moving, but you know, in our case we were lucky because we worked for one of the most prominent news organisations, for Al Jazeera, that was able to mobilise a lot of support. I'd worked for the BBC for 15 years before that. My colleague Mohammed Fahmy had worked for CNN, and I'd had good connections with CNN. So we already had connections with some of the big news organisations, and that's why we got as much support as we did, or one of the reasons. And yet there are literally thousands of journalists around the world that are still in, or hundreds of journalists around the world that are still in prison.
But that is,
and most of those are
to the
local
heart
journalists.
of one of the most relevant areas of the inequalities within our industry.
And it is. It's a very real problem. And those are local journalists, local freelancers and stringers and so on. And it bothers me enormously that we've seen that level of inequality, that we don't see the same level of support, because they're just as deserving of support as we were. And yet for some reason we can't seem to be able to develop that voice. Now, as I said, we're starting to see a push around the journalists in Turkey, and I think that's something that's very welcome, and I would encourage everybody to adopt the Free Turkey Media hashtag to keep pushing people, because actually, even though it can sometimes feel a bit ineffective to tweet a message of support, let me tell you that it does actually work. In the Free AJ staff case, our hashtag received 3 billion impressions over the time that we were in prison. 3 billion. That made a difference. It absolutely made a difference, and I think if we harness social media, if we use the kinds of new technology that we have available to us, then we can achieve something. But we need to be conscious of it, and we need to be aware of the challenge, and we need to be pushing forward together.
And Joseph, what are some of the challenges or aspirations specific to journalists in the region that you're hoping for? Sorry, hoping to tackle.
I want to talk about independency as an important point in journalism. Yeah? In journalism, independence is a must. Media should be independent. Journalists should be independent. Independent media can only be released if the journalist is independent. Independent journalists are independent and independent journalists. He has an independent attitude to maintain a principle of truth. The independence refer to here is the independence of the mind, free from the conflict of interest concerning social class or economic status, and independence of race, ethnicity, religion, and gender. And I think newsroom must be independent from the owner.
Talking about independence, I think perhaps part of the reason, I imagine, that we have lost some of the trust of the public is this question that this question about objectivity, that particularly perhaps some of the more well-known internationally mainstream media, that we may actually be run more by political and commercial concerns. Whether that is true or not, that is a perception that has affected the range of our influence. Do you think in any way it's a legitimate concern of audiences? Alep.
The claim that we have that we are objective is actually, I think, also the reason that we lost the trust of our, somewhat maybe, one of the reasons of that we lost the trust of our audience. I can say, I'm going to give an example from Turkey, but it's a Kurdish issue that you have been probably know for what's going on for the past 40 years we have. And the mainstream media, as well as it has the quality and the traditional, maybe old school media, it has the quality maybe in the terms of journalism, but also because of the even ownership as economically or the politically, especially in the countries like Turkey, like in the Middle Eastern, etc., has strong ties with the authorities such as governments and the political parties. The terms of objectivity actually only covers the mainstream, which, for example, in the Kurdish issue, I was born in 1986, and that was the one of the most, the 90s were one of the most bloodiest time of the Kurdish issues that time, the forced kidnapping, etc., and the killings. And I didn't know any of them when I was a child, when I was watching the news. It wasn't on the news. It wasn't on the newspapers. And that time we had actually most colorful, most debatable, open to debate news journalism practices regarding to this day. So the Kurdish people, I'm talking about Turkish issue, the Turkey's issue, didn't reflect themselves, didn't actually show themselves, didn't show their stories in the mainstream media. It's not just about that, actually. For example, when we look at the media itself, the mainstream media is, in the terms of women issues, we are still in the margin of the news, both covering and both becoming the story itself. So this actually caused that we lost the trust, because as journalists, when we are talking about that we are objective and we are becoming balanced in all of the means to the sites, in the reality we are not equal as our opponents most of the time. And that's the reason that actually we don't find ourselves a place in the mainstream media. So people, I mean, as the ones who trust, actually starts to telling their own stories, starts to becoming more vocal about their stories. So they actually create the alternative media regarding the mainstream. And the trust issue starts maybe over there, and became actually this year, because when people are saying that, the authorities are saying that they don't believe in media, they don't believe in New York Times, because they are not telling his story or otherwise. So it has a point in that manner. And in my opinion, I don't believe in objectivity. It's because that we are not objective. I mean, even when we are looking, looking in an angle of 120, how can I say, angle. Yeah, you got that. The thing is that we choose where to look, we choose how to look. As journalists, when we're telling a story, we actually choose to look and not to look in a part of the story. So we choose the words that we use, we choose the frame that we shot, and that's why we also ignore a part of the story, a part of the reality.
I'm just going to jump in there, because you guys I see you nodding quite enthusiastically. Peter?
I agree. I think this whole myth of objectivity is something that has caused us a lot of problems. I mean, as you said, every choice you make about the questions you ask and the questions you don't ask and how you rank, how you structure a story, they're all subjective choices. There is no such thing as objectivity. And the fact that people believe or that they read objective truth, I think is a part of the problem, because, as I said, there is no such thing. What we need to do is argue for the usual high ethical standards of accuracy, of balance, of fairness. And as long as we hold to those principles, then I think we're doing our jobs. But to suggest that there is some objective truth that we're telling is I think, a lie, and people can see through that, and they recognize that, and that does erode trust. And this question of trust, by the way, I just want to address this very quickly. I think it is absolutely crucial and something that we're losing sight of. We've heard today, and we will hear many times through this conference, about how public trust is eroding and is at an all-time low. And there's a tendency to dive for the lowest common denominator, or get stuff out there and allowing our professional standards to slip. One of the things I'm very proud of in Egypt was that we got so much support because people recognized that the work that we had had integrity. If there'd been any point in our history when we had allowed our standards to slip, the Egyptians would have trumpeted from the rooftops. People would have started to doubt whether or not we had in fact been working with integrity in Egypt. And if that doubt had infected public confidence, public trust, we would have lost it. And we would, again, still be in prison. Now, this isn't about putting us on a pedestal. This is about reminding people why public trust, public confidence is so crucially important. And if we allow those standards to slip, if we somehow pretend that we're objective when we're not, if we somehow claim to be, I don't know, more than we are, then we lose public confidence and we are finished. We can't continue as survivors in industry without public trust. And that's why this question of objectivity is an important one. That's why we need to really lift our game if we're going to keep going.
I agree with Peter, and we are so glad he's here with us. And we wish so much, that many others who are behind bars in various countries wouldn't be there. Now, it's obvious that his case was much more prominent because also of the power, and I mean also the economic power of some of the media houses, who have seen their journalists being harassed, arrested, and put behind bars. I'm recalling and really to pay homage to the IPS journalists who lost their lives. In the 70s in Latin America, a number of them just disappeared. We never heard anything about them, what happened to them. I was told recently, and in fact yesterday, we issued a special report for World Press Freedom Day in which there is an article by one of our senior editors, and he recalls that a journalist who had just taken over as the bureau chief of the Colombo office in Sri Lanka, IPS office, was arrested, disappeared, and then later he was dropped from a helicopter and he was dead. We don't know what happened. It's only now, many, many years later, that there is discussion about what happened and why it happened. And the government is now more comfortable because it didn't happen under their guard. It happened under somebody else's guard. So I think in many ways we have come a long way, but the fact still remains, and I know this, that there are hundreds of thousands of journalists in the developing countries, starting from South Africa to Zimbabwe to many countries near and around the Middle East, in Asia. And their stories don't come out because they don't have the power. And that is where I think the unity that Peter is talking about is essential. How do we get their stories out? One IPS voice, one writer from a single country writing about it, you'll have a readership. But how do we get the other journalists to rally just the way they have rallied for the release of BBC journalists, Al Jazeera journalists and others? So there is still a huge gap in terms of communication, in terms of value. Just the way we say that, today, if there is a murder in a village of a young woman raped, etc., in Nepal, the story at best trickles to national media because, there are reporters who have courage now to report on these issues. It doesn't come onto international media, but if the same thing happened in the UK or in France, etc., we would have to listen to it every day and build that momentum towards uniting to do something about it. So the gaps are still there, and I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I can tell you that it is extremely hard, and one of the things that we have to be constantly looking over our shoulders is how our journalists in the field are managing to gather these stories, including human rights violations, press freedom, etc. It's not that simple. So we need some kind of self-policing, maybe the journalists ourselves. And yesterday, we were discussing, Peter wasn't there, Mr. Horta wasn't there, and we were discussing one issue that for the past couple of weeks we have been hearing every day about the 100 days of achievement or non-achievement of a leader of one of the northern countries. Nobody talks about what journalists have achieved for themselves as such in the last 365 days since World Press Freedom Day in Helsinki. Perhaps there is a story, perhaps there are many, many stories that we could bring forward. And then the question here is, how much are we as media representatives doing for ourselves? Are we always relying on others? Are we always relying on governments, on the richer bodies, you know, to bring this information through?
May I add something here? Like, I think about being a unity and supporting each other. It also relies on the fact that maybe the problem starts that as journalists we don't trust ourselves to our colleagues as well. We don't have the solidarity. I mean, we, as one of the most maybe harassed profession in the whole professions, we don't trust each other. For example, we can see stories like a local newspaper made a story, it doesn't make headlines, but one of the mainstream just discovers that story, then goes there and makes its own, it becomes a headline. But it was a local story. But if we don't empower the local journalists or our colleagues, because we don't trust them, we need to, but we have no trust issues when it comes to the official statements or official numbers as well.
But things are changing. If you look at the Panama Papers, that was only possible by global collaboration by, I think it was between 135 different media houses from 25 different countries or the like. So things are changing, but do you think that we have the bravery to follow a path that actually we know exists, which is showing us the benefits of international collaboration?
Well, we should look at where the change begins actually, because when it comes to, I just want to add something here, like when it comes to the imprisoned journalist, the journalist who has been jailed, it is an issue now, a worldwide issue. It's not just an issue of Egypt's or Iran's or Turkey's. It's just an issue. But we know that if a Western journalist doesn't get jailed or kidnapped or killed, it's not becoming a news. In the whole, the killed media staff workers, in the CPJ's numbers, etc. Most of them are the workers, not the highlighted journalists and stuff. That's what I'm actually saying about being in a solidarity, because we only are getting in solidarity with our kind, not.
Isn't part of the problem is that we are partitioning things that necessarily don't need to be partitioned? In that, if we are working together on a story, then we have the links of communication that allow us to work together to support each other if a colleague is being harassed in some far-flung corner of the world. And we have the paths of communication open to exploit in whatever way that we need to improve the way that we're doing our jobs. Are perhaps we being a little bit short-sighted? Your Excellency.
Well, again, allow me to change, look at that from another angle, maybe, and in part to pay tribute also to many in the mainstream media, issue raised earlier. Many of the changes occurring in my lifetime, they occur because of the courage of many people in the mainstream media. Whether it was Guardian UK, The Independent, The Observer, Sydney Morning Herald, or the New York Times, these were mainstream. But increasingly, because of economics, I remember talking with some people in the big TV network. They wouldn't come, let's say, to my country, because they say, we don't have the budget for that. We don't have the money. Yes, because it's become very expensive to have a coverage of stories faraway places. They are forced to cover Syria, Yemen, and so on. But even that, they have a budget constraints. And that is, and I'm not even talking about biases, I'm not talking about partiality, some lack of professionalism, the way some, even mainstream top media, they cover issues. I'm even just talking about they constrain the reality. And this what happened. It gives where the emergence of social media, of the alternative media, digital media, increasingly the common people not relying on the mainstream media. They are going to Facebook, they are going to Google, they're going everywhere. Some are good material. I read some very good material that's coming out of Google, coming out of Facebook, etc. And so my point is to say that this situation that is fluid, evolving, it's positive. Another an example, you know, like probably many of you, we follow the events in the US. You were polite in not mentioning the 100 days of the 100 days of President Donald Trump. Well, I have to say, President Donald Trump declared most of the US media public enemy. The New York Times is his favorite enemy. I read the New York Times daily basis, opinion articles, and hardly, there's not one there that is sympathetic, kind to President Trump. And I can imagine between 2, 3, 4 in the morning, the President Trump is reading the New York Times. He reads, he gets angry, he tweets to the millions of his followers. He has more followers than the entire readership of New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times combined. And I read a particular journalist that only recently I discovered. His name is Charles Blow, Afro-American. What a fantastic writer, elegantly devastating on Donald Trump. And I don't hear him being harassed, being hassled. You don't hear about unsympathetic American TV coverage of Trump being pulled off air. Well, you see democracy functioning in the US. Almost unanimity of the mainstream media is against Donald Trump. He hates them. And yet, not one of them, those I read, well, that's the difference between them, the American solid democratic institution, and many of us, unfortunately, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. We don't dare challenge the established political and economic power. So I can only have a great admiration for the debates going on in the US.
Perhaps taking it back to the idea of collaboration between media houses around the world,
Yeah.
perhaps that is one of those arenas that could be pursued by strengthening
Yes.
international collaboration. You can do it from another country.
Exactly. So then I go to this point, you know, the Mr. Google, I think, is gone. I was very pleased to hear they do training, you know. These and many other training schemes that many have done for us in my country and elsewhere, I know over the years, have been this indispensable. There's no way around it. To be a good journalist that impart credible information to people, first you have to have qualifications, academic qualifications in the field that you are working on. Then you have to have a professional journalism training on how to investigate, how to write a story, how to double check, cross check. You require training. But then, unfortunately, in our countries, because of our finances, our economy, our journalists are incredibly poorly paid. They struggle for a meal every day. They don't have a laptop, or even if they have it, they don't have the money to pay for internet communication. Well, that's when I think international solidarity among the havers toward the have-not, to have a more level playing field, to give a chance to our journalists in the developing countries who are fantastic. In my country, we have extraordinary, dedicated, poor journalists. And their badge of honor is to criticize the government. For them, that is their affirmation of their independence.
I'm just going to cut you on there because I think we're pretty much running out of time. But prior to us wrapping up, I just want to ask Joseph, do you feel that within the Indonesian journalism community has its place within the international journalism media landscape? Do you feel any international solidarity within global journalism?
Yeah, I feel in international have a solidarity with journalists in Indonesia. We have a dark number in the past time about journalist killing, yeah, like Udin in 1999, and I think UNESCO gave a homework for Indonesian government to make a answer about how about the progress of Herlianto killing, is a journalist in East Java, and the deadline end of May. We make an answer to UNESCO about that. Then I think this is international solidarity from to Indonesian journalists.
Long may it last. Well, thank you all very much. I think we've pretty much come to the end of our allotted time. I'm just going to double check if we can squeeze out some time for questions from the floor. No, I think that unfortunately is all we have time for. So again, I'd just like to thank our panelists for sharing their insights and experience on the journalism, on journalism and its role in being a force for public good and some of the challenges it faces. Now I'm going to hand back to our lovely maitre mayor, Tia.
Thank you, Georgia. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end, but we would like to ask the speakers and moderator to remain on stage. There will be a presentation of souvenir that will be presented by one of our speakers, Mr. Yosef Adi Prasetyo, to all the speakers and also to the moderator. We would like to also announce at this time the printed copy of Mr. Ramos Horta's speech is available at the entrance of the Assembly Hall. The presentation of souvenir, silakan untuk diberikan kepada Bapak Standi atau Mr. Yosef Adi Prasetyo. Mr. Yosef Adi Prasetyo will present the memento to Mr. Jose Ramos Horta, Ms. Farhana Haq Rahman, Mr. Peter Greste, Ms. Alif Akbul, and also to our beautiful moderator, Ms. Georgia Calvin-Smith. To all our guests and also to the participants, we have lunch at the Assembly Hall 3 and at the foyer of the plenary. And then we would like to announce that the plenary sessions at the lower lobby will be conducted at 2:15. We will make a photo session. Please return your headsets to the organizing committee, and for our VIPs, just leave the headsets on your chair. We will have parallel session, venue Merak 1. Journalist safety, tackling impunity, how can crimes against media workers be effectively investigated, prosecuted and mitigated. Merak Room 2, media and information literacy as a bulwark against hate speech, misinformation and polarization online, what good practices exist. Merak 3, fostering inclusiveness and gender equality through media innovation.